Please welcome Mr. Gary Webb to the show. Why don't you tell America what the story is about first, and then we'll talk about the issues.
This was an army that the CIA started.
Better known to us, most of us who remember news, the Contras.
The Contras, an army founded and funded by the CIA.
They were selling this stuff in South Central. Tons and tons and tons of powder cocaine was going into this one small area of the city.
All of this story, rather than about crack, is about crap. Yes, rather than crack is crap. It's a preposterous...
It was an outrageous story. I mean, I admit it, but it was true.
And by the way, Mr. Chairman and members, Mr. Gary Webb is here today. He's sitting right here in this seat, and I invited him to come.
CIA is reviewing the charges made by Webb and says it will conclude its investigation by the end of the year.
Dewey Claridge was the CIA's man in charge of Central America in the early 80s.
Oh, don't give me the conspiracy bullshit. Come on, you're a more intelligent man than that. There has never been a conspiracy in this country.
Gary Webb, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, is dead. Died of an apparent suicide.
Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel.
Today I want to talk about Gary Webb. Gary Webb was a journalist who was found dead with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. And officially it was ruled a suicide, but some people find that hard to believe because of the 2 gunshots. And then other people are like, actually, that's not impossible. It happens more than you would think. And so I want to do what I usually do on my channel, which is I want to give you guys the facts. We'll discuss the theories and then you can decide for yourself. This video is not sponsored. Nobody wanted to touch this video, so I'm going to shamelessly promote my membership. $2.99 a month. You get extra videos, emojis, badges. The videos are lighthearted. So back to my typical depressing stuff. The whole thing started in 2004. It was actually December 10th, 2004. Police were called to Gary Webb's home in Carmichael, California. Gary was actually moving out of his home that day. He had movers scheduled to come that day, and they were the ones that called the cops.
Moving company workers called authorities after discovering a note posted on his front door that read, quote, "Please do not enter, call 911 and ask for an ambulance."
What they found was a very meticulous setup. Okay, I want to read you some quotes. It says, all his belongings, among them numerous awards from his years as an investigative reporter, were packed and neatly stacked in boxes in a corner of his living room. His prearranged cremation certificate and social security card were on the kitchen counter of his home. He put the keys to his cars and motorcycles in an envelope, which were addressed to his oldest son. And then they found something in the trash can. It was a framed quote. And this was like an advertisement for the newspaper he used to work for. And it said, there should be no fetters on reporters, nor must they tamper with the truth, but give light so that the people will find their own way. Well, this framed quote was found in the trash and everything was just so. Then when they got to the bedroom, they found Gary. Gary had 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Next to Gary was a .38 caliber revolver, and that was the weapon used to shoot him, we would later find out. And then the next day, Gary's loved ones started getting his suicide letters, basically. They were typed up lengthy letters that were sent in the mail, and the next day after his body was found, they started getting these letters. So it says here, quote, on December 11th, Webb's suicide notes, single-spaced and several pages long, arrived in the mail. At Gary's service, his son was reading one of the suicide notes, and it said, if I had one dream for you, it was that you would go into journalism and carry on the kind of work I did, fighting with all your might the oppression and bigotry and stupidity and greed that surrounds us. In one of the suicide letters to his ex-wife, he wrote, I do not regret anything that I have written. Word was spreading that there were 2 gunshots. and people were immediately assuming that this was foul play because of the fact that it was two to the head and his history, which we're going to get into the whole thing. In the Sacramento Bee, the article is entitled "Reporter's Suicide Confirmed by Coroner." So it says, facing a barrage of calls from the media and the public, the Sacramento County Coroner's Office issued a statement Tuesday. The cause of death was determined to be self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head, the coroner's statement said. Information and evidence gathered at the scene of the death, including a handwritten note indicating an intention on the part of the decedent to take his own life, resulted in suicide as the determined manner of death. The investigation is continuing and will take an estimated additional 6 to 8 weeks to complete. The statement was issued because of the number of calls that had flooded the coroner's office since the Bee reported Sunday that Webb's death was caused by more than one wound. Coroner Robert Lyons said his office had been swamped with calls. Quote, "It's unusual in a suicide case to have 2 shots, he said, but it has been done in the past, and it is in fact a distinct possibility." So officials basically theorized that the first shot went through his cheek and it wasn't fatal. And so he pulled the trigger again, and that one hit a major artery and was fatal. And although they couldn't determine whether he died instantly or if it was a slow, painful, bleeding out kind of death. So they weren't able to determine that, but they basically said this is kind of rare, but it does happen. Well, as you can imagine, there were a lot of people who had found that hard to believe. They refused to believe that this was an unaliving, although I think I already said the word like 4 times. I'm already giving up the fact that this is monetized, so I'm going to say suicide. Okay, whatever. So I found this article where a reporter talks about hearing a recording of reporters discussing Gary Webb's death immediately after. And this person, although there's a recording of them, they refuse to go on the record. So all we have is this reporter describing what he heard. Okay? "I told Gary not to go near this story," his source replies in an emotional voice. "You do not understand the power of these people," he adds, referring to the U.S. intelligence services. "Do not quote me. Do not quote me on anything." "You sound very scared," Moira remarks. "I am scared," the voice replies. "Look at what happened to Gary Webb. Do something else with your life," the voice urges, like enjoy it. Here's the deal. Whether you believe Gary Webb did this to himself or someone else did this to him, what happened to him was so messed up that honestly, a lot of people believe that even if he did it to himself, he was driven to do it to himself because of how hard everyone went. It just, what happened to Gary Webb was so messed up. To understand what happened to Gary Webb, we need to go back to July 1995, when Gary got a phone call that would basically change the entire course of his life. So Gary actually missed the call, but it was back in the day. So they left a little note, like a post-it on his desk, "Call back so-and-so." It was a woman. He didn't know who she was. He was like, okay, he called her back. And she says, "I am the girlfriend of a drug dealer who has been set up by another drug dealer who works for the CIA." She said that he was selling it for them, and she said, quote, "tons of it." So Gary Webb says when he first heard this, he was like, yeah, okay, whatever. And so his thing was, can you prove it? Do you have any documentation? Like, what is your proof of this? And she says, oh yeah, I can prove it. There's documents, there's testimony. And the thing about Gary is that was a great starting point for him, because Gary was the king of receipts, if you will. He was known for being able to dig up pretty much any document.
But where did you get the new information?
Well, it was just from court files. You know, a lot of stuff in National Archives mostly. A lot of these old court cases. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for information on Blandone and his boss, Noor and Meneses. The United States filed a motion asking that nobody be allowed to ask Mr. Blandone about his relationship with the CIA.
In the 80s, this whole thing came up with the Iran-Contra affair.
In the mid-1980s, there was a high-level White House conspiracy called Iran-Contra. Individuals who provided support for the Contras were involved in drug trafficking. One or another agency of the U.S. government had information regarding the involvement. Smugglers even used the U.S. government's own airlift operation at El Salvador's Ilopango Airport. This drug enforcement agent patrolled that same airport.
It was just nonstop traffic coming and going. Drugs into the U.S., cocaine specifically.
The smuggling was so open, it had to be condoned by the U.S. government.
So you were told point blank? Point blank, stay away from it. It's a covert operation being run by the White House.
The Drug Enforcement Administration said it has vigorously investigated, and no evidence has ever been found to substantiate Mr. Castillo's charges. As for the CIA, it's denied ever aiding or condoning drug smuggling.
There is no question of that. I can document that.
There were no indictments or prosecutions. Those allegations of drug smuggling became just a footnote in the scandal known as Iran-Contra.
Listen, I went to school for political science and history, so it's interesting to me. I know most of you find this so boring, so I'm not going to bore you with it, but all you need to know is that this kind of came up and was proven in the 80s. And this is going on during the war on drugs.
They're running. Please! Right side, somebody. Hands up! Get hands away where I can see him. Johnny?
Police say most neighborhoods now have a rock house. A few minutes after that, they found what they were after, the neighborhood rock house in a middle-class section of the San Fernando Valley. L.A. County Sheriff's deputies arrived and arrested the bar owner on charges of selling cocaine. Cocaine has become the in drug for rich and poor alike in Los Angeles County.
Every other house, somebody's sitting on a pound of cocaine out there.
So it's very scandalous. It's like the government is saying there's a war on drugs, but the government is also bringing in the drugs that it's at war with. Uh-oh. So as part of his research, he contacted another reporter called Robert Perry. Now, this reporter, he's the one who broke the story back in the 80s. Basically, history repeats itself. This has happened before, and this guy tried to warn Gary. Quote, I had to warn Gary that what he was looking at was probably true, but that he would run very big risks, Perry recalls. He thought I was being cowardly. I'm glad that I didn't dissuade him because it was important to get the truth out. But for Gary Webb, there was a very high price to pay. The other thing about Gary is that Gary was also fearless. He was known for that. He was a fearless digger, seeker of truth, and he liked controversial stories. He got a thrill out of it. So he began his research, and over the course of his research, which was a little bit over a year, he received several death threats. His wife even talks about it. She said that people told her it might have been inappropriate for him to take on such a story because he had a wife and 3 kids. And she said, quote, Gary thought that if something was true, it should be told. He also had this inherent belief that the truth could not harm him. He really did believe that back then. She pauses. That said, he did sleep with a gun under his bed. Now it's August 1996, and Gary Webb publishes the article. It's entitled Dark Alliance, and it went viral before viral was even a thing.
Gary Webb, are you there this morning?
Yeah, I am.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
We've had so many calls about this, is why we asked you to do it.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it. You can download the whole thing from the internet with all our documentation, with sound clips so you can hear Danilo Blandón testifying to this in his own words. We've got this tool now called the World Wide Web where you can show people the documents you use. If it says set a report, you can click on the word report and actually read the report.
sjmercury.com/drugs.
So at the time, this blew up. At one point, it was getting over 1 million hits a day. By the way, the article is no longer available online on the website like how it was because the newspaper took it down. We'll talk about later why they did that. But there is like a print version that I've linked below if you want to read it in full. It has like an intro from someone else. And it doesn't have the hyperlinks. So, but it is the words that, you know, the article. It was sensational.
He wrote a story called The Dark Alliance. Mr. Gary Webb to the show.
It was only because, you know, some people at National Archives believe freedom of information means freedom of information. We got some documents that showed that pretty strongly that there were some CIA connections.
Accusations underscore the word accusations that the CIA knowingly and intentionally did what amount to pump crack cocaine into Los Angeles to help fund rebels in Nicaragua.
LA attorney Harlan Braun insists there is strong evidence of a CIA drug connection. Braun is no radical. In fact, he represented one of the LAPD officers in the Rodney King case and seized documents indicating drug money was being used to purchase military equipment. Most of the evidence was seized later by federal agents, the rest currently under court seal.
Can you stay for a few minutes? Gary Webb is on the line, and if you want to stay and talk about this article, I need some help here.
You know, I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds like the wildest conspiracy theory, which is why all our supporting documentation for the thing is posted on the internet.
Webb says Freeway Ricky helped trigger an epidemic of human misery.
All the black men are in prison, most of us.
Rick Ross is now serving a life sentence for cocaine distribution.
The women are still strung on the drugs, kids without fathers, without mothers.
How much responsibility do you have for that?
A lot. A lot of it was my fault. I played the game.
Rick Ross's drug supplier did have connections to the Contras. Dateline has been able to confirm that from former Contra leader Eden Pastora. So we asked Gary Webb, where is the evidence the CIA knew of any drug dealing?
You have to define the CIA. Did people who were working with the CIA know they were doing it? Yeah. Did the director of the Central Intelligence Agency know this? I don't know.
This is nonsense.
Now retired, Dewey Claridge was the CIA's man in charge of Central America in the early 80s. He insists the agency had nothing to do with any drug trafficking.
Oh, don't give me the conspiracy bullshit. Come on, you're a more intelligent man than that. Come on. I mean, come on. There has never been a conspiracy in this country.
Never?
The CIA is reviewing the charges made by Webb and says it will conclude its investigation by the end of the year.
As a result of the allegations in the article, you started to have a bunch of congressional hearings.
That 6 former CIA employees and a former DEA agent refused our request to be interviewed. We had no power to compel them to do so. I do not believe it is likely that any significant information that would have substantially altered the conclusions of this volume has escaped our attention. CIA officials mistakenly identified one of the Contra members as a former CIA asset. Unfortunately, the CIA attorney cannot recall the facts of the case or the meeting in question. We have found no evidence in the course of this lengthy investigation of any conspiracy by CIA or its employees to bring drugs into the United States.
You say that the CIA became involved mistakenly.
The agency mistakenly identified as that of an asset. It was a Hispanic name that was remarkably close to the name of an agent that had worked for us.
What about this fellow, the CIA attorney that could not recall the facts of the case or the meeting in question? That doesn't sound to me like full cooperation.
And in point of fact, that's what we were stuck with.
We now turn to you.
Mr. Chairman, I very much appreciate the invitation to appear here this morning. Criminal organizations are perfect allies in a covert operation. If you sent me out of the country to risk my life for the government, to do something as a spy in a foreign land, I would think criminals would be my best ally. They stay out of reach of the law. They know who the corrupt government officials are, and they have them on the payroll. They'll do anything I want for money. It's a terrific working partnership. There's a second problem, and that is when you run covert operations, you train people in a lot of skills. And when you teach people how to change their identity, how to hide from the law, how to build bombs, how to assassinate people, they don't forget how to do it. At various times, the intelligence community inserted itself in that legal process.
When you say inserted itself into that process, are you suggesting that the intelligence community thwarted or stopped prosecutions which have gone forward?
That too. When we got into this area, we confronted an absolute stone wall. Bill Weld, who was then the head of the criminal division, put a very serious block on any effort we made to get information. There were stalls, there were refusals to talk to us, refusals to turn over data. We had a series of situations where Justice Department people were told that if they told us anything about what was going on, they would be subject to very severe discipline.
So what you're saying is that the CIA individual did not stop him from dealing in drugs.
Right.
But he did not encourage him to deal drugs.
No.
In the Mercury News series, Adolfo Calero and Enrique Bermudez, were either of those individuals involved in the investigations which you conducted?
Certainly. They were central figures in the Contra movement, and their names came up again and again in conversations about the problem.
Were they involved in cocaine drug trafficking?
Directly, to my knowledge, no. I have to say no.
All right. Indirectly, to your knowledge?
Many of their people and their close associates were.
Mr. Calero, we will begin with your testimony. Did you ever know Mr. Blandón?
No, I could have seen him as a child in Nicaragua.
Did you know his parents?
I knew his father and I knew his mother, yes.
Where did you meet Mr. Meneses?
I met Mr. Meneses in San Francisco, California. I talked to, I talked to all of them. How are things going? What are you doing?
Did Mr. Meneses ever provide any money for the Contras?
Not 1 cent.
Do you know that Mr. Meneses was engaged in drug trafficking?
I had no idea that he was engaged in drug traffic. All of this story, well, rather than about crack, is about crap. That's my crap. Yes. Rather than crack, is crap. It's a preposterous, ridiculous.
Now we will have order. We will have order.
There was an outrage, particularly among Black people in LA, because they were the hardest hit by the crack epidemic. It was so bad that the director of the CIA went to Watts and had a town hall meeting.
The director of the CIA was in Los Angeles today.
It was an extraordinary sight today.
I will get to the bottom of it, and I will let you know the results of what I found.
How are we supposed to trust the CIA official to investigate themselves?
As a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. You should immediately bring that information to wherever you want, but let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department. If it turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable. We're going to do more to stop drugs from coming into the United States. Thank you very much.
A lot of people were waiting on the bigger newspapers to dig deeper into the allegations made by Gary Webb. What ended up happening instead was kind of like a smear campaign against Gary. Instead of these major newspapers digging into the claims that he made, they dug into him and his article instead. So it was like, instead of addressing what the source is saying, they basically attacked the source.
But 9 months after the series was published, the controversy continues. Some of the heavyweights of American journalism have examined Webb's work and found it reckless, often wrong.
The first one to do it was the Washington Post. They published an article titled, "The CIA and Crack. Evidence is lacking of alleged plot." The Washington Post did not go nearly as hard as the LA Times. Turns out, people who worked for the LA Times at this time, they say that the LA Times was actually pissed, humiliated, and insulted by this article because they felt like they were scooped in their own backyard, because this is an LA story. They should have gotten the scoop, and here some rinky-dink Bay Area newspaper is coming out with this explosive story that they feel they should have had. According to former LA Times employees, the LA Times assembled a team of at least 17 reporters. It says one of the 17 referred to it as the Get Gary Webb team. Another said at the time, we're going to take away that guy's Pulitzer. That's the other thing about Gary is he was a respected investigative reporter. He wasn't for a huge newspaper, but he had gotten a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the earthquake. He was part of a team. He also did another investigation about corruption in the DEA and won an award for that. So this isn't some like crackpot journalist, but they made it out like he was. Then after the LA Times came the New York Times. In all fairness, because that's the point of these videos that I make, I want to give you every side, every angle. There were flaws in Gary Webb's reporting. It was the editor's job to catch these things, to vet these things.
We have Nick Shao. He is the author of this book, How the CIA's Crack Cocaine Controversy Destroyed Journalist Gary Webb. You write that his editors betrayed him. How?
Gary's reporting, as I found actually, was accurate. The CIA acknowledged that it had covered up its relationship with drug traffickers. But the story, had some very inflammatory language in the lead paragraph with the logo showing someone smoking crack superimposed over the seal of the CIA.
It says the normal process is, or should be, that a reporter files a story and is robustly challenged by his paper's lawyers and editors, who, if satisfied that the report is accurate, publish, then defend the writer to the hilt. Should these editors subsequently deem the story to have been fatally flawed, they take the consequences. This did not happen in Webb's case. So there's like a journal called Studies in Intelligence. It's like an internal journal in the CIA. And there was a article titled Managing a Nightmare, CIA Public Affairs and the Drug Conspiracy Story. This was like an internal report that was written. It was released and unclassified in 2014 as a result of a Freedom of Information Act request. And in this article, they say that they didn't even have to discredit or smear Gary Webb, the CIA, because the media did it for them. And they talk about how because they had good relations, already, quote, productive relationships with reporters, they were able to do the dirty work for them, essentially, and that the CIA even broke its protocol of responding to certain things to give statements to some of these newspapers discrediting Gary. Quote, for example, in order to help a journalist working on a story that would undermine the Mercury News allegations, Public Affairs was able to deny any affiliation of a particular individual, which is a rare exception to the general policy that CIA does not comment on any individual's alleged CIA ties. They also mention how they successfully discouraged one major news affiliate from covering the story. Then they also talk about when that shift happened and how those articles came out from the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and then it was like the whole public opinion shifted. It says here, that third week in September was a turning point in media coverage of this story. Respected columnists, including prominent blacks, began to question the motives of those who uncritically accepted the idea that CIA was responsible for destroying black communities. At the time that this was happening, which was in the late 90s, there is an organization called FAIR. It stands for Fair and Accuracy in Reporting. They held a news conference in Washington, D.C., where they were basically trying to tell the public that the media was not reporting this story fairly, that they're actually actively trying to suppress this story.
This isn't our allegations. This is the allegations on the CIA's own records. Won't let the newspapers deny what we've documented and what the CIA themselves have documented.
The media has a long and distinguished track record here of suppression. The scandal involves the media, so the media is not interested in investigating themselves.
What happened next was a series of internal investigations. I love internal investigations because when you investigate yourself, there are no biases. Throughout all these investigations and all these hearings, okay, Gary Webb kept coming up.
Mr. Hitz, did you interview any of the following? Gary Webb?
No, we did not.
And by the way, Mr. Chairman and members, Mr. Gary Webb is here today. He's sitting right here in this seat, and I invited him to come. He's put a lot of time and work into this investigation.
Everybody is focused on Gary Webb and the Mercury News, the San Jose newspaper, and The pressure was immense. It is said the executive editor of the Mercury News, his name is his last name is Sepos. Sepos initially defended Webb and reportedly showed up at an in-house party wearing a military helmet. And it was like they were ready to defend him and fight for him. But then something changed. I don't know what pressure he was feeling. Something happened and he issued a retraction.
His own executive editor admitted the articles oversimplified the origins of the crack epidemic and left out important conflicting evidence. He also wrote, "I feel that we did not have proof that top CIA officials knew."
This right here was the nail in the coffin for Gary Webb. Even that CIA journal internal thing that leaked that I told you about, even they mentioned it. It says here, the Mercury News soon found itself the target of so much media-generated criticism that it resorted to the unusual measure of scrutinizing its own series, addressing the criticism, and conceding the paper might have done some things differently, including calling the CIA, not using the CIA logo, clarifying its use of the term CIA's army. So Gary Webb was a leper. He became a leper. He was blacklisted. Nobody wanted to touch him. He was demoted. They didn't outright fire him. They demoted him. It says they had him writing obituaries. The first story he had to file was about a police horse which had died of constipation. On top of that, they were gossiping about him in the office, laughing at him, making jokes about him. They also started bringing up his past. When he became this document digger-upper that everyone talks about, it all started on accident. He stumbled upon a police report that caught his eye. Quote, his curiosity was piqued one day by a police report he discovered. On the surface, it seemed like just another homicide. The owner of an adult video store was found dead. Webb dug for months and was able to write an investigative piece that linked the man's death to organized crime in Kentucky's coal industry. Hooked, Webb decided to focus his career on uncovering the misdeeds of the powerful. He always had receipts, but his receipts were so good that sometimes when he was writing, he was making leaps and jumps and saying things that would push the boundaries. His editor said, quote, all his research was meticulous, but when it came to writing, he pushed the envelope. I would always find myself deleting adjectives and adverbs. We had quite a few jousts. He was sued for libel like 4 times. The newspaper that he worked for would have to settle, but it didn't actually ruin his reputation in a sense. Some people felt like he was a little risky, but other people felt like he's getting sued because he's striking a nerve, he's touching a point. In addition to lawsuits, he won awards for his reporting. Gary's coworkers actually kind of resented him, especially when it came to the awards that he won, because he won the H.L. Mencken Award for a story exposing corruption in California's Drug Enforcement Agency, and he also won a Pulitzer Prize when he was working for the Mercury News, reporting the 1990 Loma Prieta earthquake. But his colleagues were upset with him because they claim he referred to himself as a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, which they felt was like too confident or self-involved, because it implied that he won it alone and not as part of a team. And so they kind of resented him for that. At this point, Gary's been demoted. His colleagues are making fun of him. He's just hating his life. And so he decides to resign on December 10th, 1997. A year after Gary published this article. Now, the same year that he resigned was the same year his editor and the boss on top of him, the one who wore the military hat and then turned on him, these two people got promoted. 2 years later, he was promoted to vice president of Knight Ridder, the Mercury News' parent company. So he became vice president of the newspaper's parent company. Okay, so he rose up the ranks. Gary, he doubled down on this article. Even when everyone turned against him, he ended up writing a book with the same title, Dark Alliance.
It's Friday, the middle of the month, August the 14th. This is C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Coming up on our program, Gary Webb, who's the author of a new book called Dark Alliance. A story that we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about is on the front page of the New York Times, and it's this headline: the president weighs admitting he had sexual contacts, including oral sex. Gary Webb, on that note, good morning to you.
Thanks. That's a fine note.
We'll be talking with Gary Webb for the next hour and also discussing his latest book called A Dark Alliance. There's an article in the latest edition of Esquire, the September edition, with the headline, The Pariah. Have you ever been called that before?
I've been called a lot of things before, but never a pariah, although in this case I think it's meant ironically.
Charles Bowden wrote the piece 2 years ago. Gary Webb wrote a series of articles that said some bad things about the CIA and drug traffickers. The CIA denied the charges, and every major newspaper in the country took the agency's word for it.
True. True, and that was the strange part about it.
What are you doing these days?
I'm working for the California legislature investigating government agencies. I work for the Task Force on Government Oversight.
Gary Webb, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
The thing about Gary that you need to know as well is that he was clinically depressed, and for a while, before even the Dark Alliance series. Actually, that series, according to his wife, kind of got him out of his depression. It says, after he left the Mercury News, he wrote a book about his CIA findings. The mainstream press largely ignored the 2-inch thick tome. In his misery and depression, he had a series of affairs. His wife discovered his infidelities and filed for divorce in 2000. He started missing appointments. He started losing weight. He stayed up all night playing video games and struggled to get up in the morning. And thus begins Gary's downward spiral. During this time, there was this short little documentary thing I found on YouTube. It's called Gary Webb in His Own Words. And there's footage of Gary Webb and he's talking about what happened. He was defending himself and his story to the very end.
My name's Gary Webb. I am an investigative journalist. I've been an investigative journalist for about 25 years for daily newspapers. And in 1996, I wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance, which was about CIA involvement in drug trafficking. Investigative reporting is being sort of squeezed out of the picture, and I think intentionally, because it tends to ruffle feathers. I mean, good investigative reporting does ruffle feathers, and it draws lawsuits, and it gets newspapers in trouble. It was essentially a war between my editors and myself, because I wouldn't apologize for the story or back away from the story, and fought them on it publicly. And so they transferred me to a bureau that was 140 miles from where I lived, and I called in sick a lot.
Shortly after this was filmed, he gets laid off from the job he had. According to his wife, he called her. Now, this is his ex-wife at the time. She says, he rang me up that day. It would have been our 25th wedding anniversary. He was crying. He kept saying that he would never get another job in journalism. She helped him, and even his kids helped him. They tried to get him out of the depression. They did like 50 resumes and mailed them out to 50 different places to try to get him a job in journalism, to try to give him something to look forward to, and nobody responded. As I said, he was totally blacklisted. A lot of what we know about this comes from Gary's wife, Susan. She says that he was taking a cocktail of antidepressants, and then he stopped taking his meds, and then after he stopped taking his meds, it really got bad. She says that he was intentionally crashing his motorcycle. Here's a quote. She says, he started having a lot of motorcycle accidents. He had 6 in a short period of time. On one road trip in 2001, he came off the motorcycle and split his helmet open. He told the guys with him he was fine. She recalls, got back on the bike, then passed out. Half an hour later, he crashed and shredded his clothes, face and body on a barbed wire fence. He was taken to the hospital by air ambulance. With hindsight, she says, the signs were there. On one time he called me and he said, I have this plan that will benefit us both. I realize now he was talking about suicide. Or sorry, she said he was thinking about suicide. There are things to suggest that Gary was planning his suicide for a while. Gary was now in debt because he lost his job. He couldn't get another job. So he had to sell his house. And the way the dates lined up is kind of strange because he resigned on December 10th. His house was, he was going to move out of the house that he sold on December 10th, which was also the day he was found dead, on December 10th. Even a reporter asked his wife, like, do you think that was a way to get back at them? The newspaper, like revenge, like a final act, like the anniversary of my resignation is when I'm killing myself. And she says it was despair that he was in such despair that it was about that. The plan was December 10th, he was going to move out and go move in with his mom, but instead he was found dead. The day before he was found dead was not a good day for Gary, according to his ex-wife, because someone stole his motorcycle. And she really thinks that was the straw that broke the camel's back. On the last day Webb was alive, his motorbike broke down while he was moving to his mother's house. A passing motorist, a heavily tattooed young man, gave him a lift home, then returned and stole the motorcycle, which police recovered from him 3 days after Webb's death. It sounds crazy, says Belle, that's his ex-wife, but having his motorbike stolen was the last straw. He was so depressed, it was just more than he could take. So the last time anyone saw Gary Webb alive was the night before he was found on the 10th. So December 9th, he went to his mother's house. Remember, he was supposed to move in with her the next day, and that motorcycle accident had happened. It says, the night he died, he dropped a box of mementos off at her house. He told her he didn't think he had anything to live for. That was the last time anyone in his family saw him alive. He came home and put his belongings in order and threw that poster in the trash, the one with the quote about truth and journalism and shining the light. They say he put his keys and ID cards on the table, and the cremation certificate that he had purchased for himself, which is another sign people point to that he was planning this. And he picked up the .38. It was his father's revolver, and the rest is history. So the reporter that was interviewing Gary Webb's ex-wife told her, like, you know, I'll be honest with you. When I heard this and it was 2 gunshots to the head, like, I thought that somebody took him out. And he says that she shook her head no, that it wasn't foul play. And then he asked her, but what about the 2 gunshots? And she explained to him that it went through the cheek. I'll read you the quote. His former wife, her voice lowered to a whisper, explains that Webb missed the first shot, which exited through his left cheek. The second bullet, adds Bell, struck his carotid artery. Gary Webb died in 2004. It was officially ruled a suicide, and that was the end of the story. His family agreed with it. They came out. They were like, listen, it's a suicide. And so that was that until 2014, when there was a book first before the movie. The movie came out in 2014 called Kill the Messenger. And this is based on a book with the same title written about what happened to Gary. And basically it was kind of like Gary was vindicated. It was a retelling of the story with the inclusion of the smear campaign and the fact that most of what he said was actually true. And so it was like 10 years after his death. Now he's being hailed as a hero. And a lot of the older journalists even wrote about it. Some doubled down and said he's not the hero they're making him out to be. Like, this movie is not even based in reality. Some said they went too hard on him and kind of like walked it back. So those are the facts. Now, let's discuss the theories. Hear me out. Hear me out. I'm annoying. So there are basically 2 main theories. You've got the official story, suicide theory, and then you have foul play, somebody did it, we'll discuss who. So let's start with the official story, which is that he did this to himself. There is evidence to suggest that. First of all, is his family being really adamant that this was a suicide, because they know his depression. They know the way he is and how the smear campaign had devastated him and how he couldn't find a job and how he would cry and how low he was feeling. And I feel like if the family is saying it, they know more than we could ever know. And that, I think, puts a lot of weight to what they're saying. I mean, even his son has come out and said that, I know it was a suicide. I know the letter that I got. Yes, it was typed up and people tried to tell him someone could have faked the letter and mailed it out and pretended to be your dad. But he's like, I know how my dad writes and what way he talks. And he mentioned things that nobody could have known. And so he really does believe that it was a suicide. His whole purpose since high school, he had this passion for journalism and investigative, like controversial things. He thinks he's breaking the story of a lifetime and he's going to make a real impact. And instead, he gets turned into a laughingstock. He's at the point where financially he couldn't even pay his child support. He's losing his house. He's going to move back in with his mother. After all this, that's a hard pill to swallow, especially if you've been up here and now you're down here. It's like, for some people, they can't handle it. A lot of people kill themselves off of financial things. I think it's a statistic. What was that? Even the guy who wrote the book, Kill the Messenger, he said, quote, the CIA didn't really need to lift a finger to try and ruin Gary Webb's credibility. They just sat there and watched these journalists go after Gary like a bunch of piranhas. They must have been delighted over at Langley the way this all unfolded. That's the thing. Why do you need to kill him when you've already done worse than killing him? Because when you kill someone, you make them a hero. You make people believe what they had to say, make them a martyr essentially. But if you discredit them and make them sound crazy and make them self-destruct and almost prove your point, that's more powerful than killing them. A lot of people who don't believe the CIA was involved or anything, they talk about the length of time that passed between when the article and the height of all the drama of that happened, as well as, 8 years later he died. Like, maybe it wasn't... Is that the doozy? They're like, why would the CIA do this 8 years later? You good? Oh. So my dog sneezed. But another way to interpret it, and this brings me to the foul play theory, was that Gary Webb's research was actually resurfacing. His whole story was resurfacing because if you look at the context of the time when Gary Webb died, which is December 2004, at that time, there was a lot of wars going on. This is the post 9/11 world we're talking about. There's a war in Iraq, there's a war in Afghanistan, and there's already rumors again of drug trafficking, the opium, and the whole thing with the Afghanistan and the opium. It's a whole thing. And it was so crazy because the only video I could find of a reporter announcing Gary Webb's death was this very alternative, not mainstream media. It's like Democracy Now! And they were announcing other things that happened that day, and I was shocked.
The apparent suicide of investigative reporter Gary Webb. Stay with us. New questions have emerged over whether foul play was involved in the death of a top government scientist. Officials at the time said that David Kelly had committed suicide by slashing his wrists. But now the two paramedics who treated Kelly at the scene have come forward to tell the Observer newspaper that Kelly could not have died from the wound they saw on his wrist.
You've got a whistleblower that is suicided, as they say. Even the Ukraine thing was going on too at the time.
Doctors in Vienna have confirmed that Ukrainian opposition leader and presidential hopeful Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned several months ago. In other Ukraine news, the Associated Press is reporting the Bush administration spent more than $65 million over the past 2 years in the lead up to last month's election in the Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has charged Washington with interfering with Ukraine's internal affairs.
History repeats itself. History repeats itself. When will we learn? Never. So anyway, so that's just to give you guys context of what was going on. A lot of people say that during that time, the administration, the way things were at that time, there was a lot of suppression by any means necessary to preserve national security. And they don't find it that much of a stretch that they wanted to take Gary Webb out in 2004. So let's talk about other things within the foul play theory. In the 80s, there was quite an explosion of cocaine in the United States. Wasn't there? There was a lot of cocaine. They didn't do what they were supposed to do, essentially, to stop this, because the interest of fighting communism was higher than the interest of not allowing these drugs to affect communities. And when you look at which communities were affected, that's when you get into the conspiracy theories. And some people say it's not a theory, it's a reality.
Accused the CIA of conspiring to target young African Americans.
Is the CIA willing to poison our cities and crack cocaine?
One of the biggest conspiracy theories that not only came out after this, but is still really, really popular today is that the CIA did this intentionally, put drugs, crack into the system to undermine the black family, the way the black family was undermined with slavery. And then it's also tied in to the Black Panthers, how they were doing stuff for the community, but they were also taking guns and going down to Washington, and people were freaking out. And then they became demonized, and there was a campaign to take the Black Panthers out. And so a lot of people connect crack being introduced to the black community as not the way to undermine the black community in general, but actually the Black Panthers, and that the black community suffered the most consequences of all this. And that in itself is a whole other theory, a whole other rabbit hole. I mean, you could go down so many different things and research, and I mean, I can't speak on it as informed as I would like to, other than to tell you as part of these theories that that is a theory. It really comes down to your faith in certain institutions, your beliefs on what the government's role is and what it actually does. And that's really going to inform how you feel about this. Could someone have staged this suicide to make it look like a suicide? Yes, it's possible. They could have done that. It's not impossible. Who knows who it could have been? It didn't have to be the CIA. It could have been a disgruntled person from all the names that he named and all these characters that you never know. It also could have been a suicide. The guy was clinically depressed before the smear campaign. Then there was a smear campaign, and he couldn't get a job to save his life. Maybe even literally to say, no pun intended. If you ask me what I think he probably killed himself. But if you were to ask me a follow-up question, is the CIA responsible for Gary Webb's death? I would say, allegedly, don't sue me, that the argument could be made that the smear campaign and the backlash that Gary faced after telling us pretty much the truth led to the spiral that led to his suicide. You cannot put that on someone else, but what happened to him was messed up. He should not have been blacklisted like that for saying the truth and for his editors not doing their job. That's how I see it. Anyway, so that is my opinion on the subject. I'm so sorry this took me so long to do. I watched hours and hours of footage from the 90s, like congressional hearing. Like, I watched so much, I read so many things, and I've tried to condense it down to you as much as possible to make it actually enjoyable. If anything, I hope it passed the time. Okay? Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Look at my doggies. I just have to show you there. If you guys are wondering, this is usually what's behind me. Okay, bye.